understand now is the notion of a psychoanalytic act and the outcome of psychoanalysis. Are people familiar with the play Antigone? Sophocles' play Antigone? Okay, do you mind if I just give a very, very brief and probably very poor summary of Antigone, because it's crucial that you know Antigone if you were to understand Zizek's reading of the act. And here you may be able to, it's been a long time since I've read it, so you can correct my mistakes. Antigone had two brothers, Polynices and Eteocles. I can't remember the name. Eteocles was the king of Thebes. Please correct me if I get any of this wrong. Eteocles was the king of Thebes. Polynices, his brother, aspired to the throne of Thebes, so allied himself with a rival city, whose name I cannot remember, and attacked Thebes, okay, to try and seize the crown from his brother. In the battle, both brothers were killed. Right? Now, they were killed outside the walls of Thebes. After the battle, Creon took over the throne of Thebes. And as punishment against Polynices for rising up against the city, he ordered that rather than being buried with full honours and in full state, as was befitting a prince of the city, Polynices should be left outside the city walls, where he lay to be pulled apart and eaten by the dogs. Okay? Eteocles would be buried with full state honours. Now, when she heard this, Antigone decided that she would bury her brother. Essentially, that she would go against the order of Creon, the new king of Thebes, and she would bury her brother as was befitting the rituals and customs of the city, whatever she said, whatever was said. And she carried out this act. Because she carried out this act, Creon put her to death. And she was locked in the tomb with her brother, where she suffocated and died. Now, as this is a Greek tragedy, of course, everyone has to be dead at the end of it. Creon's son was in love with Antigone, so when he heard that, Antigone had been killed, he killed himself. When Creon's wife heard that her son had died, she ended up killing herself as well. Again, I'm not sure the details of all this, it's a long time ago. So Creon was left king of Thebes, but everyone around him was dead. Now, in terms of the tragedy, there is a conflict here in relation to the law. What is the higher law? Is it the law of the city, the law of the state, the symbolic law that we live by? Is this the law that dictates how we should behave and how we should act? Or is there a higher law, the law of the gods, which overrides the law of man, the law of the city, and that we should act according to this law? Right? So there is a conflict here between different understandings of the law. For Creon, there's no question here. The law of the gods is the law of the state, embodied in the figure of the king. They are the same thing. Right? So when he says that, Polynices will not be buried, this is the law of the gods. There's no distinction between the two. For Antigone, there is a distinction here. There is a higher law and a higher imperative that she is acting by, and this justifies her act, even if she goes against the law of the state. Now, this act, the act of Antigone, is for Slavoj Zizek the epitome of the political act. All right? an act which is groundless, an act which is not founded in any particular ideology or any particular formal symbolic law, but simply comes out of its own imperative. At the same time, this act changes everything. This act changes the whole socio-symbolic universe that we live by. After Antigone has acted, the state collapses. Creon's son is dead. His wife is dead. The brothers are dead. Antigone is dead. There is just him left on the throne. Nothing is the same again. No one can follow him. He has no heir. Right? So in this act, sui generis, out of itself, okay, everything is changed. This is what, for Zizek, is the epitome of the act. And what he does is he distinguishes this notion of the act from what he calls activity or action, in the sense of everyday political activity. That is to say, that activity that takes place within the constraints of the law, within the constraints of a certain social symbolic framework. For example, you know, it's a bit like in Britain, for example, in Western democracies, where we have a choice. You know, we can vote for a right-wing Conservative Party, or we can vote for a left-wing Labour Party, Socialist Party. Okay, we have a choice that we can do this. We put a lot of activity into deciding who's going to vote and whatever. But whoever we vote in, we still live within the same system. Okay? Nothing changes. The room for manoeuvre is very limited. We, in Zizek's words, you know, we still live within capitalism. All right? So this activity doesn't actually change the symbolic universe that we live in. The difference between the act and activity, in a Zizekian sense, all right, is whether or not it changes the framework itself. All right? And this will be, I mean, we can come back to this in the discussion at the end if you want. This will be the value of this as a kind of political strategy, I think, is very, very questionable. Now, the paradigmatic example of the act for Zizek is Antigone's no to Creon. It is completely unexpected, it comes from nowhere, and it changes everything. But I think this also highlights two of the problems of Zizek's notion of the act. Activity for Zizek is associated with masculinity. And this goes back to the Freudian distinction of male activity, female passivity. Okay? Activity is associated with masculinity, and the act is essentially feminine. Furthermore, as Antigone's suicide shows, the only successful act for Zizek is suicide. Now again, as a political strategy, this doesn't seem to be very helpful. Okay? It doesn't mean that we should all go out and commit suicide by that, but what he calls symbolic suicide. So the act is essentially feminine, and the only really successful act is suicide. Now, as both Stavrakakis and Russell Grigg argue, Zizek's notion of the act increasingly reveals his distance from orthodox Lacanianism. Antigone and Antigone's act in Seminar 7 for Lacan is the founding of his early notion of psychoanalytic ethics. The basis of a psychoanalytic ethics is, as Lacan says, not to give way on one's desire. Okay? The only thing you can do in terms of psychoanalytic ethics is not to give way on one's desire. Now, in later seminars, Zizek replaced this notion of ethics with what he called an ethics of the drive. Right?